Well, Bill, I'm not sure why the Euthyphro dilemma keeps coming up, and we'll define it in a moment, even though we've done many podcasts on it. It's very often the go to argument against the moral argument for God. Do you think the Euthyphro dilemma has been sufficiently answered by Christian philosophers?
Oh, yes, Kevin, just repeatedly. I don't think, frankly, there's any life in this dilemma left. It's just beating a dead horse. But people like Jonathan Pierce, I think, frankly, are not very well informed about it.
That is the author of this article, Jonathan M.S. Pierce, a tippling philosopher blog, Morality, the Euthyphro Dilemma, and William Lane Craig. Uh, he begins the article. William Lane Craig, a noted Christian apologist, uses the argument for morality as one of his arguments for the existence of God. This is probably one of the weakest arguments put forward by apologists for the existence of God, as the following article will illustrate. Bill, stopping
Well,
right there.
yeah,
Do you
we'll
think
let our listeners judge whether they think his article illustrates that. But I want to draw attention to a couple of red flags here that ought to alert our listeners whenever they encounter this sort of dismissive attitude. It is not an argument that is simply put forward by apologists. This has been an argument that for centuries have been defended by some of the greatest minds in Western world history. And on the contemporary scene, it's defended by people like Robert Adams in what has become a modern classic, Finite and Infinite Goods. In connection with my systematic philosophical theology, where I'm now writing on the goodness of God, I reread Adams' book, and it's no wonder this has become a classic in our day. It is a brilliant treatise on metaethics in which he defends God as the foundation for our objective moral values and duties. And this kind of theistic based ethics has also been defended by people like Philip Quinn and William Alston, Jean Marie Idziak, John Hare. So, Jonathan Pierce, when you see this kind of dismissive attitude and the characterization of these people as apologists rather than philosophers, this should alert the listener, or in the case that you're encountering this yourself, the reader, that you're dealing with a person who really hasn't grasped the profundity of the question that is under discussion.
Pierce continues next, quoting William Lane Craig puts forward his morality syllogism thus: Premise one, if God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist. Premise two, objective moral values and duties exist. Conclusion, therefore, God exists. He says premise one is an example of begging the question fallacy, that is, smuggling in a desired conclusion into one of the premises.
That's patently false. Uh, One begs the question when your only reason for affirming a premise is that you already believe the conclusion. But premise one is a claim that is not made uniquely by theists. This is a claim that is made by very many atheists, like Friedrich Nietzsche, Bertrand Russell, Jean Paul Sartre, J.L. Mackie. They claim that if God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist. And since they are all atheists, they cannot be accused of begging the question in affirming the truth of this premise.
Yeah, he says next, there is no justification to assert that morality is contingent on the existence of a deity, and it is thus a non sequitur. On this basis, one would be equally justified in saying, if 2 plus 2 does not equal 4, then God does not exist. However, 2 plus 2 does equal 4, therefore God exists.
Now, there's two things to be said. First of all, those who have defended this first premise, whether atheist or theist, most certainly do offer arguments on its behalf. I think most powerfully, If you remove God from the picture, it is very, very difficult to see why, on naturalism, human morality would be anything more than just a subjective illusion that has evolved among human beings because it has survival value in the struggle for existence. But secondly, it's almost funny, his parody of the argument is invalid. He says if 2 plus 2 does not equal 4, then God does not exist. However, 2 plus 2 does equal 4, therefore God exists. That's arguing not P implies not Q. P, therefore Q, which is an invalid argument. That's the non sequitur. It's not the moral argument, which is perfectly valid. So Jonathan is completely confused here. The argument that would be parallel to the moral argument would be to say if God does not exist, then 2 plus 2 does not equal 4, but 2 plus 2 does equal 4, therefore God exists. That would be parallel. But the parallel he constructed is simply an invalid argument.
Next, he says, worse than this, he does not even specify which god he is referring to. Would the Roman god Mars be somehow linked with morality? It seems somewhat unlikely. Skipping down there, he says that, Bill, you're probably referencing the Christian God of the New Testament. So is it necessary to be more specific about which God when you're presenting an
No,
argument
the
like this?
moral argument leads to a kind of generic theism that would be acceptable to Jews, Muslims, Christians, deists. What it's arguing for is that there needs to be a being which grounds and exemplifies moral goodness and whose commands thereby constitute our moral duties. And that's why something like the Roman god Mars would be singularly inappropriate to fill such a role.
Jonathan continues, premise 2 is also just an assertion with no evidence presented to support it. In his debates, William Lane Craig asserted something like, deep down we know this to be true, with no further justification. This is just an appeal to emotion and hardly an intellectual defense of this premise. Since premises 1 and 2 are problematical, it follows that the conclusion does not warrant belief. Bill, your thoughts?
Yeah, I wonder if Jonathan believes that there are objective moral values and duties. I wonder if he thinks that torturing a little girl just to watch her scream is morally indifferent. What does Jonathan think about that? When I say deep down, we know that there are objective moral values and duties, what I mean is that if we're honest with ourselves, then we'll admit we know this. People like Jonathan might give lip service to relativism, but I don't think they really believe it. I think when you're honest with yourself, you will recognize the reality of objective moral values and duties. So this isn't just appeal to emotions. I'm asking people to be honest with themselves and to look at their moral intuitions. I remember in my debate with the atheist philosopher Louise Antony, she put it so well. She said, any argument for moral skepticism will be based upon premises which are less obvious than the reality of moral values themselves. Now, if that's right, and I think it is, then it would never be justified to be a moral skeptic.
Well, next he brings up the Euthyphro. He says,
Okay.
quoting, in any event, the moral argument is easily refuted using the Euthyphro dilemma. The dilemma, which is adapted from a Socratic discourse, is expressed thus: A, does God say something is moral because it is moral? Or B, is something moral because God says so? If the answer is A, then there must be a standard outside God for judging what is moral. So God is just passing along moral standards external to him, and thus it makes God redundant in determining what is moral. If the answer is B, then God's commandments are basically arbitrary. One day, God could say murder, rape, and robbery was okay, and we would have no choice but to follow his commandments because he is all powerful and can impose any standard he likes on his subjects. Might makes right. Is that defined right, Bill? Then the
Yes,
Euthyphro?
it's a popular version, but I think that it basically presents the alleged dilemma. Um, and I've argued that this is not a genuine dilemma. That you can do the escape that is performed by both philosophers and matadors alike, which is called splitting the horns of the dilemma. You craft a third alternative that avoids these two unpleasant horns.
Pierce then says apologists like William Lane Craig try to circumvent this dilemma by saying that there is a third option. Let me just stop there, Bill. That's one of those red flags again, saying apologists like
Yeah.
William Lane Craig, not realizing that he is an apologist as well. He's defending a particular view, trying to give arguments and evidence for his view. So he's one too.
Yeah,
Um,
and
I,
it's
I,
insulting not just to me, but to people like Robert Adams and Philip Quinn and John Hare and David Baggett and so many other fine ethicists who think that the Euthyphro dilemma is invalid and that there is a very clear third option that is quite acceptable.
he says you try to circumvent this dilemma by saying there's a third option, that is a trilemma. That is, God's commandments are good because God's nature is good. So they are trying to use B with the extra condition that it is impossible for God to issue any commandment that is not good.
The idea here of, for example, Robert Adams' divine command theory is that our moral duties are constituted by the commands of a just and loving God, so that God is by nature just and loving, and that he issues commands to us that reflect that nature, so that his commands are indeed the source of our moral obligation. But this avoids the arbitrariness objection because those commands must be consistent with God's nature.
He continues, this presents a whole range of problems since this is saying that God has no free will, since he can never initiate any evil command to do any evil deed by his action or inaction. How can theists say that free will is such an important attribute given to humankind, even though it will allow some evil, when even God does not possess it? Does this mean that humans have a power that even God doesn't have, and he is therefore not omnipotent? That seems to be the case. If this is proposed, apologists argue, it is not that God could do evil and simply decides not to do the evil. It is impossible for God to do evil because of his nature. Several things to respond to there, Bill.
Here, Jonathan has really deserted the question of the Euthyphro dilemma, instead to talk about whether omnipotence is consistent with God's moral perfection so that God is unable to do evil. That's a different section of my philosophical theology that I'm working on, the omnipotence of God. And I would say that overwhelmingly, philosophical theologians contend that divine omnipotence does not imply the ability to actualize logically impossible states of affairs, like a square circle or a married bachelor. And so it is logically impossible to actualize the state of affairs of God's doing something evil. And therefore, this is not an inhibition upon omnipotence. God has free will just in case nothing determines him to act as he does. It's up to him. And certainly, he does have free will in that sense. God is not determined by anything to do what he does. But that doesn't mean that therefore he can act contrary to his own nature and bring about something that is logically impossible. So there's no inconsistency here with either the concept of omnipotence nor with God's having freedom of the will.
Willie, brings the article to a conclusion, Bill, by saying, if apologists like Craig say that God's nature is good, we can ask a similar question to the original dilemma. That is God's nature good according to an external standard, or is his nature good when based on his internal standard?
Well, we've already answered that question. God's nature is the good. It is the paradigm that determines what goodness is. Here's an analogy that William Alston gave. The length of a meter used to be determined not by a certain abstract length that you measured. Rather, the length of a meter was determined by a meter bar, which was housed in the Bureau of Weights and Measures in Paris. It was the paradigm of a meter. So whatever was the same length as that bar is a meter long. Now, that has proved to be too ambiguous for modern subatomic physics, and so the meter has been redefined. But nevertheless, it gives an illustration of how something can be the paradigm for something else, and thereby define what it is to be a meter, or in God's case, to be good. And so the answer to the dilemma is that the good is what God is. God, that is the paradigm of goodness. And then things are good insofar as they resemble that paradigm.
Well, Bill, the Euthyphro dilemma just keeps coming up year after year. I guess we'll continue to address it from time to time as anytime it starts making the rounds again.
I would say, Kevin, that the benefit or the profit from Jonathan's blog here would be that it would be a really nice exam in a freshman course on apologetics, where the moral argument has been discussed. Say, okay, answer this. And I think that the students would really have fun in doing that.